The most important thing I learned listening to Thomas Bergersen's music is that there is always another layer. Just when you think you're hearing everything, go back and listen again and you will hear some element you didn't catch the first time. For example, in Colors of Love from the album Sun, at first it sounds like a pretty simple texture on orchestral strings. But then you realize that there's this bubbling synth underneath everything. There's also a warm, smooth pad providing ambience and sustain. And there's even a low drum accenting the very first beat. So even the simplest, most basic part of the track is already at least 4 layers deep. When I think of epic trailer music, there is no artist even close to the top of the game as Two Steps from Hell. Nick Phoenix and Thomas Bergersen are masters of that huge cinematic style. And at the request of Wade Smith, who won our first composing competition, I've been specifically listening to Thomas Bergersen's work to figure out how he pulls it off so well. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 things I've noticed Bergersen does to make his music so awesome. And thank you to Wade for getting me to pay attention because they're so good. I plan on incorporating them into my own work. So I'm going to say that first one again because I think it is that important. There's always another layer. Here's a section from the track Dragonborn from their latest album, Myth. There's a melody on the middle strings, a counterline in the high strings, bass and harmony in the low strings, piano in the background, flute runs in some of the gaps, and with all of that going on, it wasn't until going back and listening again that I realized there's also a French horn on that melody line with the cellos and brass supporting the background harmony as well. It's not super easy to hear, but I'll try to EQ out some of the highs and lows so you can focus more on that French horn register. I was working on music for a corporate video recently, and I got it to a place where I was happy with it and about to send it to the client when I suddenly remembered this idea. There's always another layer. So I went back and added some more pads on the chords for fullness and a simple flute part in the high register that was repetitive enough to recede into the background, but filled in that otherwise empty pitch range, and a few other textural elements. I didn't really change the music at all, but these extra layers made it even fuller and richer, and it totally worked. The client is always happy with what I send, but this time the feedback was, wow. When I interviewed Wade, who you'll remember inspired this video, he mentioned how he incorporated some of these layering ideas in his competition entry.
It's all about the subtleties, right? It's all about being an artist, right? Adding the small little details.
I think the production, is probably what put this over the edge. Speaking of the competitions, our next one will be announced at the end of the year, and it's going to be video game themed. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the announcement. Let's move on to lesson number 2. It's possible to be big the whole time and still have room to grow. Now that kind of seems like a paradox, but Thomas Bergersen manages to make his tracks sound huge and powerful right from the start. Jump to only about a minute into the track New Life and the sound is freaking huge. I would be so satisfied to achieve a massive sound like that. But jump ahead to 4 minutes in and holy it's insane. But that earlier section was also full and powerful. So how's he pulling that off? Well, one way is by making use of the full range of registers, from down low to way up high. Back to that earlier section in New Life, he's got the women's voices in a middle register, brass in that warm tenor range, strings below, behind, and above the voices, including in a very high range, big, deep drums, a mid-high instrument that might be a dulcimer. Essentially, he's leaving no blank space on the canvas. Of course, this does not apply to every track in every style, But when your goal is to specifically achieve a massive full sound, making use of the full spectrum of registers will help you get there. I think another way he pulls off that sense of fullness is with this sort of rule of three when it comes to rhythm. It's very common in Bergersen's music to always have 3 layers of rhythmic activity. A long, slow background rhythm, like one chord for the whole bar, often with sustained pads or strings or brass. A middle layer at roughly the pace of the tempo, usually with more variety than just ticking off the beats, but quarter and eighth notes is the general pace. This will usually be the featured melodic instrument. And then a third layer that is rhythmically very fast, like 16th notes or constant eighth note pulse, usually arpeggios or an ostinato figure on strings or synths. Evergreen from the album Vanquish is a good example. Early in the track, it's at a pretty low energy relative to where the track is going, but he still gets a very full sound with this rhythmic stacking. We have an active ostinato part on the piano and celesta, a slow background rhythm with the bass and sustained chords, and then a melodic line on the choir and violins that's somewhere in between. When I spell it out like this, it feels like, yeah, that's a fairly standard arranging technique, so what? But it's such a reliably consistent part of his style that I think it's worth keeping in mind. Just like he has vertical fullness by using the full register of low to high, he's achieving horizontal fullness with a different pacing of rhythmic layers. And again, the main point was that he's able to pull off a big, full sound even in his relatively quieter sections, because of how he takes advantage of all the available space. Another thing that stood out to me about Thomas Bergersen's style wasn't immediately apparent until I realized how hard it was to find examples that didn't have it. So one idea I had for this video was to try to recreate one of his tracks completely in the DAW, trying to capture every instrument and drum part and counterline and so on. It was something I immediately regretted as soon as I got started. But anyway, while looking for a good track to do a sound alike of, I kept finding example after example where there were prominently featured vocals. And I thought, that'll be way too hard to recreate. I'll just move on and look for a track that doesn't have vocals. And I kept looking and looking. I even got Wade's input, who knows this music deeply. And it was really hard to find candidates for a remake that didn't have vocals. So I thought, maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe the human voice is one of the secrets to that epic cinematic sound. So I could literally pick almost any Thomas Bergersen track to illustrate my point here, because that is the point. So how about Creation of Earth, another one from Sun? And yeah, the drums and brass are huge too, but try to imagine how much less impactful this would be without the voices. An interesting thing is that I made a video recently about the music from Ori and the Blind Forest, and how the composer Gareth Coker also used human voices to breathe life into that score. If you're trying to unlock the secrets to a lush and rich sound with your music, like Thomas Bergersen and Gareth Coker, then you need to watch that video next, where you'll learn the 3 different elements that make music feel alive. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.